My buddy Johnny Lightfoot turned me on to this article on notreble.com in which Corey Brown, the author of this short article, let us listen to the isolated bass tracks from the Rush song Limelight, which appeared on the Moving Pictures record. And in the article is a link to a YouTube video which lets you listen to that bass track all by itself with just a hint of the band playing in the background so that you can kind of hear where they are in the song, but you can really hear what his bass sounds like. Now, Corey writes in the article that there seems to be a lot of debate about which bass Geddy used on this recording, and I do remember a whole bunch of Rush enthusiasts saying no, it was his jazz bass, and other guys saying no, it was the Rickenbacker, and even other Rush fans saying no, it's some sort of Jack secret bass that he only uses in the studio and that no one has ever seen. And yeah, that debate has been going on for a long time, but for me, it's pretty obvious. It sounds like Geddy's jazz bass, and the reason that it sounds that way is because of some processing that they put on it, but more importantly, it's how Geddy plays his 72 jazz bass, and it's only on the front pickup, and that's a much different sound than we're used to hearing on a traditional jazz bass. So I decided to make this video to show you a little bit about how to get that kind of tone and that kind of voice out of a jazz bass, but you're not ever going to be able to get the actual sound that Geddy Lee has because 1, you're not Geddy Lee, 2, you don't have Geddy Lee's jazz bass, and 3, you're not Terry Brown, who was instrumental on getting this particular sound on the recording. So while you can't get that exact sound, I'm going to show you a way to approximate how that sounds with any sort of jazz bass. So what I've done is made a Cubase project here, and this first track is the isolated bass track that Geddy Lee played. And then I've got some other examples of some other jazz basses with both pickups on and just the front pickup on and so forth, and I'll take you through those one by one. But first, let's listen to just the original isolated bass track from Limelight. Now that particular sound is a really lush, wonderful sounding rock and roll bass track, and what makes it sound so cool is the bass line itself and also some of the processing that they used on that jazz bass. And it sounds really husky and almost breathy. It's a really, really cool sound that a lot of people have worked a long time to try and approximate. So let's talk about how you could get something close to that tone. So the first thing I did was I took a Squire jazz bass. This is a Chinese jazz bass that I have modified slightly with jazz bass pickups by EMG, and then it also has a badass bridge, the same kind of bridge that Geddy has on his original 1972 jazz bass. And then I recorded the sound of that bass in 2 different ways. One track with just the neck pickup on, and then another track with both pickups on. Now let's listen to the difference between those 2 tones. And right now there is not going to be any additional processing on that track. So this is just recorded direct with the bass plugged right into the audio interface. And that's going to be the same for all of these tracks that I recorded. So you're not hearing any additional processing right now. So let's take a listen to the Squire jazz bass with just the front pickup on. And you can hear that it actually does sound pretty close to the original track. It doesn't have as much mid-range, and we're going to add that later, but what it does have is some of that husky, breathy tone. It almost sounds like overdrive. Now that's a much different voice than we're used to hearing on a jazz bass, unless you play a jazz bass with just the front pickup on a lot. Now let's listen to the same performance, but this time I recorded with both pickups on, and this is going to give you more of a stereotypical jazz bass sound. It's going to be more scooped out in the middle. Let's listen to both of those. Let's listen to the neck pickup again. So that neck pickup has more of that husky, breathy sort of tone. Whereas with both pickups on, you just lose a bit of that quality. And that's how I was able to zero in on the fact that, yeah, that's just a jazz bass with the neck pickup on. And then, since I wanted to get closer to the sound of Geddy's original jazz bass, instead of using the Squire jazz bass, I grabbed my Geddy Lee signature bass, and this one is modified as well. Changed the pick guard, obviously, and I took the original pickups out because they are just boring. And instead, I put in the same sort of EMGs that I put in the Squire jazz bass, and this one came with the badass bridge already on it, so I didn't have to buy that after the fact. So this is a modified Geddy Lee jazz bass, and it's a much heavier instrument. It's denser, and therefore it's going to have more of that mid-range to help me approximate that sort of jazz bass sound on Limelight. So now I've got that recorded on this track. So now let's listen to the Geddy Lee signature jazz bass with the neck pickup on only versus the Chinese-built Squire jazz bass with just the neck pickup. So that has more mid-range versus the Squire jazz bass here. So we have decided that we want to use just the neck pickup only, and we're going to use this track, which is the signature jazz bass. I'm going to solo that, but then let's add the effects, at least that I hear, that were placed on the recording either during the recording or in post-production. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in a little bit of overdrive by using the VST amp rack that comes with Cubase. I'm going to turn that on, and then let's take a look at the settings. All I did was add a tweed model with a 1x12 speaker cabinet, and then placed a condenser and cardioid microphone dead center on the speaker. So let's listen to the before and after of that effect on that track. So here's before, then you'll see me click it on for the after. And that gives us a bit of that overdrive. And now let's use the compressor, and I'm going to use this Stephen Slate compressor. This is the red compressor in his virtual bus compressor rack. And you can see I've got it compressed really hard. So now if we listen to the before and after of both of those effects on the track, getting close. Now here's the real secret part of this particular sound. Since a jazz bass has a naturally sort of scooped out sound, to get the sound that was recorded on Limelight, you're going to have to add a whole bunch of low-mid EQ, right around the 500 to 700 hertz range. And to do that, I used the Vox & Go Curve EQ, which comes with Cubase 7.5. So I'm going to double-click on that to open the control panel here. And you can see that I added some low end, I scooped out some of that 250 hertz, and then I really boosted between about 400 to about 700. Put a little bit of edge in there in the high mids, and then rolled a lot of the high end off. So now let's listen to the before and after of that EQ. And now with those three effects on, let's listen to the before and after. And then just to help really approximate that sound, I'm going to add a couple of analog-style devices made by Stephen Slate. I'm going to go to the virtual tape machine here, which is a tape emulation, and I'm going to fire that up. And I'm also going to approximate the analog recording console that was used. I'm not really sure what they used, but for bass, I really like the sound of a Neve console, so I'm going to use the Steven Slate Virtual Channel, and I've got it set to the Neve emulation. Let's go ahead and turn that on. Now let's listen to the before and the after. Now let's compare this sort of tone to Geddy's original tone. So I'm going to rewind here and we'll bounce back and forth between these two. Here's my tone. Now let's listen to the original. So we're getting kind of close, and in fact, let's just take a listen to the Squire bass with those same effects on that channel, and you can hear that we get kind of close with that as well. Just doesn't have quite the mid-range that the signature bass has right here. Now, some of that huskiness and that breathy sort of sound that I really like in that original Geddy Lee recording is probably coming from the strings being much lower than I like on my basses. I like a much higher action, but it sounds like his strings are ringing a little bit more, and because those strings are closer to the fretboard, it gives it more of an overtone effect like a fretless bass does. So that, in combination with Geddy Lee, really fantastic bass player, playing his bass, and Terry Brown adding that really iconic sound to that bass and that player, is where that sound comes from. It's a really hard sound to nail down, mainly because you're not Geddy Lee. But here's the good news. Rush isn't hiring any new bass players, so you don't need to sound exactly like Geddy Lee. But if you do want to make your jazz bass sound a little bit more like Geddy Lee's, those are the kinds of effects that you would use to make it happen. And remember, you just use the front pickup. Don't roll any of that rear pickup in at all. It won't help. So roll that back pickup all the way off and just use the neck pickup. And now I'm going to do what I hope you do, and that is run upstairs and throw the Moving Pictures LP on my phonograph and listen to that entire fantastic sounding record one more time for about the millionth time. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video.